Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Responsible Down Standard in Action. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also will be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the bottom on the webinar doc. Any unanswered questions will be answered afterward via email. Now on to Callie Weldon with Textile Exchange. Callie?
Thanks, Rose. Thanks for getting us started. This is part of a series of standards in action that the standards team has put together, and we had previously done wool, and now this webinar will focus on responsible down. We have a lot to dive into today, so we'll get started with introducing some of the presenters that you may be familiar with. Ashley Gill, the Director of Standards. We have Trini, and she is the standards manager, and then myself, and I am the standards coordinator. And here's a slide of the rest of the standards team. You can see that we've grown over the years, and we have people all across the globe, from Canada to the US and even in Taiwan. So the agenda for today, we're going to provide an overview of the new RDS 3.0 that was revised and released this past year. We'll get into some chain of custody questions regarding the CCS, and then we'll also talk about labeling and claims and on-product claims, and then talk about some ongoing standards work with an interview with Alex Eakins from Canada Goose, and then we'll talk a little bit more about RDS adoption. So I'll hand it off now to Ashley Gill.
Thank you so much, Callie. As most of you know, the RDS was developed primarily with animal welfare in mind. The standard has a few objectives. We're looking for ways to essentially verify that down and feathers have come from supply chains where animals haven't been subjected to any unnecessary harm. We also feel like standards are a really strong way to reward and influence good actors in the industry, and also to incentivize progressive improvement, continuous improvement, towards those best practices. We also really understand that companies need tools to know what is in their products and how to make accurate claims, and so the standard exists for that purpose as well. We provide a strong chain of custody for the certified materials as they move through the supply chain. So the standard covers a lot of different, we really are looking at animal welfare primarily at the farm and at the slaughterhouse level. In the collector-based supply chains that have much smaller farms and have a little bit more of a informal supply chain, the standard can cover that aspect as well. We also pick up from the feather and down part to move to a chain of custody model that moves through each step in the supply chain. So everybody in the system is, if there are animals on site, then they're being verified against a strong set of animal welfare criteria. And then as the down and feathers move through the supply chain, it provides that level of verification for the end product. And looking at the animal welfare in particular, Textile Exchange, as you may know, has a suite of animal welfare standards that all are part of the same unified approach to animal welfare. And what we're looking at, in the past, we've talked a lot about the 5 freedoms of animal welfare, and we still think that that's a really great way to look at animal welfare. We also think that it's not only about making sure that bad things don't happen, but also providing environments where they can flourish. So we've now started kind of talking about the 5 animal welfare provisions. But these are the areas that the standard covers. So we have specific requirements that link to each one of these sections, looking for sufficient feed and water suited to the animal's age and needs, the living environment to make sure that it's healthy and safe and also encourages normal behavior, animal management, that any kind of human and animal interaction is handled properly, that there's treatment when they're sick or injured, that their operations when they're moving them around also minimizes pain and distress. Also in the handling and transport, Most often the birds are only transported once from the farm to the slaughterhouse in the industrial supply chain. And we work to make sure that we have requirements that protect their welfare in that part as well. It's also true that an auditor cannot be on the farm at all times. And so while observing what is happening on a farm in any given day can give you a good indication of how, how the farm is run, whether the animals are safe, whether they're afraid of the handlers, but also having a strong review of the management plans and procedures, interviewing workers to make sure that they understand the procedures, they know what to do in certain situations, it's kind of another way to demonstrate that the farm is compliant with the standard and that they're following these good practices throughout the year and not just on the day of the audit. Whenever most of you know that it was in July of 2019, we released version 3.0 of the Responsible Down Standard. And while this revision was happening, Textile Exchange was kind of reorganizing a little bit of all of our documents, the way that we produce standards, and that type of thing. So we have the Responsible Down Standard that was updated and released in July of 2019. We've also recently, in February, released a user manual that is really for certified entities. We have sections for farm, for slaughterhouses, and supply chain. And this document is not intended to replace anything in the Responsible Down Standard, but rather to kind of give additional guidance, give interpretation. We have procedures for proper handling, for proper stunning before slaughter, how to come up with a euthanasia management plan, all of that type of additional information that's really crucial for complying with the standard has all been included in that user manual. We've also made multiple translations of this document available to the industry as well. Another document that we've added on is a certification procedures document, which really just is intended to help the certification body understand what we expect of them that's unique to this standard. And that's in addition to the other set of requirements that certification bodies have. And one thing I want to mention is that when the RDS standard was released in July of 2019, the deadline for compliance with the new version was set for July 1st of 2020. And most of you should have received a communication that that deadline has actually been extended to October of 2020. And the reason for that is because of we know that COVID is having a pretty big impact on the supply chain and the ability for auditors to get out in the field. And so we felt that in addition to the updated COVID policies and the review process that we're continuously going through to support sites and certification bodies through COVID, that we felt that delaying the deadline for compliance with RDS version 3 was also a way that we could acknowledge kind of the unique circumstances that we're in right now. So just a reminder, the deadline for compliance with RDS 3.0 has been extended from July 1st of 2020 to October of 2020. A little bit more detail about the actual changes in the standard. And I think this is important to talk about in advance of that October 2020 deadline. There are some fairly significant changes that are being required at the farm and slaughterhouse level. For the supply chain, since those requirements come from the content claims standard, which Trini will talk about in just a second, there's not as much to change for a supplier or a brand ahead of that deadline, but there are pretty significant changes at the farm and the slaughterhouse level. Some of those changes are just how the document is structured, how the requirements are listed. We've gone to a traffic light system to indicate the different levels of nonconformity. But a big area where companies will need to put new systems in place are around the specific criteria that have been changed. So some examples of that are requiring euthanasia to be practiced, requiring stunning before slaughter to be in place with the prescribed methods of stunning. We also have increased the requirements around training. So workers that are interacting with the animals need to have been part of a training plan. And then there's also some more minor details like outdoor access, the time frame for outdoor access, the type of access to water. So we know that birds, waterfowl in particular, you know, they're waterfowl and they have a lot of natural tendencies to preen and to use water in their normal behavior. And if they don't have access to that water, it can create, you know, other behavioral issues as well. And so in the new version of the standard, we've required access to water where they're able to dip their heads. So they may not have to be able to swim, but they do need to dip their heads. And we are recommending that they're able to swim as well. So those are just some examples you can find on our website, and Trini and Callie will list where those places are in the website later on. But you can see those strengthened criteria. We can keep going. Yep, and with this part, I'm going to hand it over to Trini.
All right, thank you, Ashley. Hi, everyone. I will talk to you a little bit more about our chain of custody system. So we all know that the challenge is really managing the complexity of supply chains, and we all wish that we could easily trace the source of a product back to a t-shirt or a product hanging in a retailer's window. But in reality, we know that supply chains are way more complex and convoluted. So our solution to that is really the principles of chain of custody, which consists of three things, which is product identification, product segregation, and volume reconciliation. And the first one, the identification, really means that certified and non-certified product have to be separated at all times. Certified product has to be accurately identifiable. The segregation means that they have to be separated. So not only does it have to be labeled correctly, the certified product, but it also needs to be stored separate from non-certified goods. And the volume reconciliation looks at outgoing products matching the materials that have come in to ensure that not more is sold than what was purchased. So the goal of our chain of custody is really to track material through the supply chains for the RDS beginning at the farm all the way to the final product. And we do this by way of scope certificates and transaction certificates. And the scope certificates that you see here in green certify or apply at a company level. And the transaction certificates are product specific and move with the material through the supply chain. Next, let's look at a bunch of common certification questions. So a lot of times we receive the questions, where do I even start? How can I get started? And the first point really is to reflect and make a commitment to preferred fibers and materials, to reflect on the lines that you have, set a target for the volumes and the products you would want to start with, defining the qualities and the quantities, choosing partners, and I'll get to that in a second, to then begin your certification journey and to, at the end, basically brag about your great work. So how do you find certified suppliers? Generally speaking, we recommend to work with your existing supply chain, which is the point 2 on the slide. And for that, it is important to understand how certification works, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. But a big part of that is motivating your supply chain to get certified, and we provide a lot of resources on our website and with our staff. But the second point is to tap into already certified supply chains. And we have a list of certified companies on our website, which is also linked at the end of the slide. And you can also link up and contact members via the hub that we have, which is a platform for members to engage in. The steps to get certified are the same for every entity that gets certified, no matter which player they are in the supply chain. And it begins with selecting an approved certification body. We have a list on our website of who's authorized per standard and per geographic region. You would send in an application to a certification body. Your audit will get scheduled. You undergo the audit. Upon the completion of the audit, you will receive a report and potential follow-ups for nonconformities that will have to be rectified before you will receive a certification decision at the end. Another question we receive often is, how much does it actually cost me? And that is a very difficult question to answer because the cost really depends on multiple factors. And I've listed them here, from the application fee of the CB to the scope and the audit fee. A big portion really is audit travel, depending on where the CB has auditors present and how easy or difficult it is for them to get to your location. There's also textile exchange fees and transaction certificate fees that apply. Now let's look at claims and labeling. There really are two ways how you can communicate with your supply chains, and we separate them by general marketing claims and product-specific claims. And an example of a general marketing claim really centers around a general commitment, excuse me. So one idea would be, or one example would be, I'm committed to sourcing RDS certified down by 2025, or all my duvet covers will be covered by RDS certification by 2020. So it is really a commitment to using the standard. The product-specific claim can happen online or offline, but it is tied to a specific product, like you see here at the example of the RWS. And it is accompanied by different indicators of, so not only the brand's name and the logo, but also the certification body is anchored in that hang tag and the certification number, which the CB issues. So when it comes to making claims, here's another simplified supply chain. The darker blue shows you the certified entities in order to make a claim, as well as the non-certified organizations in a lighter blue, and the grayed out bubbles, which are the consumers, which are never part of the certification. So important here is that textile exchange requires all sites to be certified up to the seller and the final business-to-business transaction. And it's usually the garment manufacturer to the brand, but depending on the brand's goals of labeling, it might be the brand. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So if the brand, for example, sells their products to retailers, there is another business-to-business transaction, and the brand will also need to be certified in order to make product-specific claims. Retailers, on the other hand, who conduct business-to-consumer transaction will never have to be certified. So really to emphasize this, that certification is required up to the seller in the final B2B transaction, but it does look different in different supply chains for manufacturers, brands, wholesalers. It is important to note that the certification process for a brand is the same as for every other entity in the supply chain. But it is good to note, if we have listeners today that are not yet certified, that there are exemptions in place for brands that have wholesale networks, and the content claim standard in Section D goes into a little bit more depth. But there are 3 exemptions that I've listed here: the 100% clean material, batch code label, and brand network certification that could come into play for certification. So to sum up the requirements for labels, at minimum, you will have to do 3 things. And the first one is to have a proof of a certified supply chain up to the seller and the final business-to-business transaction. We also have a logo use and claims guide for the RDS. You will have to comply with the RDS logo use and claims guide. And at the end, you will have to seek approval from the certification body on the claims you will want to make. So next, we will talk a little bit more about the standards work that we have in progress. And the first one I want to mention is the content claim standard that is the backbone of our existing standards, the textile exchange, is currently undergoing a revision. And we are now at the first green bubble that you see, where we just concluded the open feedback period, where we collected feedback on our existing CCS 2.0. We are now in the process of developing the issue papers where we identify key issues that have come up during the open feedback, or also just working with the CCS for the past couple of years. We will then form an international working group and hold meetings, and together with the IWG, we will make a decision on the new draft CCS 3.0. Once we feel good about having a draft together, we will put that draft up for public consultation, which is scheduled to be sometime around early next year, Q1 2021. And that is an opportunity for the public to collect more feedback on the draft, provide more input, what is working, what is not working. We will then include that feedback and create a final CCS 3.0, which is scheduled to be released around May 2021. And now I'm going to hand it back to you, Ashley, to talk about the claims framework.
Sure. One more area that Textile Exchange is updating is in our logo use and claims. So right now, all of the Textile Exchange standards have their own logo use and claims guide. And a lot of the information is fairly similar, but with kind of small tweaks. And we're going through a process right now of revising and developing a unified claims framework that will oversee all of Textile Exchange standards. There will still be unique guidance around logo use, language, and that type of thing for specific standards, but we're going to have one kind of coherent policy that provides oversight for all of these areas. This is another case where, even though we're not going to use an international working group, we do still want feedback on this process. And you may have already seen or been notified of an open, we have an open survey right now on feedback for some of the allowed claims that we are considering. So one of the big changes is that rather than having guidelines that are just on, these are some guidelines of what you should and shouldn't say, we're actually going to move to a system of having a set of allowed claims that we won't really, we'll just approve those allowed claims. So you can see for the survey, we've provided a PDF that has a list of what some examples of those allowed claims would be, and we're asking for stakeholder feedback on those. So if you haven't received that notification and you definitely want to participate, feel free to send us a note and we will make sure that you get added in. I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of adoption of the RDS and where we think the standard is headed. So these are our numbers these are the most recent numbers from 2019. And we've seen pretty consistent growth in the adoption of the standard. And that number, that 1,041, is not the individual, that is the number of scope certificates at the facility level. So all of the individual farms kind of, in most cases, sit underneath a scope certificate. So we've split out, these are the kind of production sites, the scope certificate holders on the left, and then the number of farms on the right. So we've seen a pretty significant growth in the number of sites, but we've also seen a pretty big growth in the number of farms as well. And I would say that as you can obviously see, the majority of these farms are in China. I think that makes, it follows the trend of where most of these are produced. Poland is also a fairly strong contributor. So the growth rate at the farm level appears to have kind of flattened out a little bit, but we're still seeing growth in the supply chain. And I think the takeaway from that is really that while there may not be increasing numbers growing at the farm level, we are seeing a stronger move to a full supply chain being certified. So in the beginning, where we may have had a bigger representation from like the suppliers or manufacturers, that we're starting to see even more increase in the garment level production and the brand and retailer side. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is that across all of textile exchange standards, an area that we're really learning more about and investing more in is monitoring and evaluation of the standard. And if you're not familiar with that term, essentially what that means is just tracking information from the certification to get an idea of how strongly we actually are contributing to the goals that we have. So we started this webinar off talking about the objectives of the standard. And one of the things that we want to do is to continuously track information about the volume of material, how it's kind of growing over time. So you'll notice that in that slide before, we didn't mention the volume because that's not data that we currently actively collect, or I should say comprehensively collect. But that is an area that we want to move to. We would also like to learn more about where RDS down is sitting in terms of the market share. Global down and feather production is a really hard number to find. There's not a lot of great data sources for that. And so it may be a challenge to see, what percentage our volume is sitting at, but that's something that we're looking at. We also want to keep a closer eye on the number of brands and retailers that are committed to the standard, but to get a little bit more involved in understanding what their commitments look like, how they're progressing towards those commitments, and tracking the brands that have made a commitment and then been able to reach that. And we have on the RDS website, we have a listing of Find RDS, and I think this commitment will kind of look like potentially revamping what that process is for adding folks to that public list of companies that have made commitments. Stakeholder reach, we also, part of understanding who is being certified and the commitments that are being made is that we want to make sure that all of when we run an IWG process, that we really reflect who is being affected by the standard, who the stakeholders are. And having better data about the certification process gives us that ability to do that. For nonconformities, this is also really, really helpful for the revisions of the standard. So we're not as interested in, this specific farm had these nonconformities. We won't collect that level of information. We will collect aggregate reports of, in this particular region, these are the nonconformities that we're seeing really common. Or, we've put this recommendation in the standard, and actually 50% of the sites are already able to comply with it. So if that's the case, then maybe that's an area where we can strengthen the standard and bring those remaining 50% up to that same level. So those are just some of the areas that we're looking at in terms of monitoring and evaluation and how we grow the standard over time. And I think we have, although we didn't mention it at the beginning, I think we have, the next slide is yes, so I'm very, very happy to introduce you to Alex Eakins. She is the Senior Manager of Corporate Sustainability at Canada Goose, and she's actually here to do a little brand interview with us. Alex, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, thanks, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So I have a few questions for Alex that I'm going to take us into. And during this time, I know that we mentioned it ahead of time, and it looks like there have been some great questions coming in. And I think we'll have enough time. If you have actually any questions for Alex that come up through this interview, just feel free to pop that in as well. But Alex, to get started, can you tell me a little bit about your role at Canada Goose?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm coming up to about 1 year at Canada Goose. So it seems like we've done a lot in the last 12 months, but I just cannot believe that it hasn't even hit a year. And I will say the sustainability team at Canada Goose is about 1 year old as well. So still fairly new. We have a team of 3 people that work within corporate citizenship now. So it grew quite quickly. and probably will likely continue to grow. So my background, I actually came from environmental affairs at the Royal Bank of Canada. And then prior to that, I was at Sobeys, which is a grocer in Canada, where I did sustainability for them, specifically, of course, around food. So my role at Canada Goose is around implementing the sustainable impact strategy, which if anyone on the call hasn't seen, Canada Goose released our first ever sustainability report on Earth Day this year. So it was a big feat and a big accomplishment to get that out when we did. But within that sustainable impact strategy, we outline objectives within our corporate strategy, environmental impacts, so carbon emissions, energy use, habitat preservation, as well as waste reduction strategies. And then we have specific goals in sourcing, so raw materials such as down, manufacturing and chemical use. And then we also have specific goals around transparency and global impact. So that's kind of an overview of what we do.
Thank you. And one of the reasons in particular that I thought that Canada Goose would be a good company to talk to is that you actually already had your own internal program to verify the sources and animal welfare of the down and feather material that you were using. And Canada Goose actually recently made the decision to transition to using the responsible down standard. And I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit more about how Canada Goose made that decision, why they decided to move to using an international standard.
Yeah, for sure. So to your point, we did have our own internal standard. It was called the Down Transparency Standard, or DTS. It was, quite a few years of work went into it. It was considered world-class proprietary standard and hits many of the requirements of RDS. But what we did is we did look at 4 specific areas when analyzing kind of our future state within raw materials. And those 4 were stakeholder engagement, increased credibility, chain of custody, and protecting animal welfare. So when we looked at kind of those 4 areas and comparing DTS to RDS, we saw that there were some very clear opportunities with aligning with RDS. And also, I think at the beginning of this process, we thought it would be quite simple in theory to move to RDS from DTS. We did find, and I'll probably get into that with further questions, that there were some significant milestones that we had to get over. But I think just to go over those specific areas within stakeholder engagement, of course, with DTS, it was very much internal. So we wanted to have the opportunity to work with other leading groups and within a multi-stakeholder group to make sure that it was continuously improving. Within increased credibility, RDS, of course, is publicly known. And the fact that it was an independent, globally recognized voluntary standard where a professional third-party certification body audits each stage, we just thought that this would really hype up our credibility when it comes to consumers. And then chain of custody. This was one area that we definitely identified areas of improvement. And we wanted to make sure that if we were transitioning to RDS, we would have that assurance that, that material would be maintained throughout the entire supply chain. And then animal welfare. So DTS, we did have a pretty strong animal welfare portfolio that actually aligned quite greatly with RDS, but we wanted to kind of have a future, again, looking state. And we believe that by aligning with RDS, we would have the opportunity to continuously improve. So within our sustainability report, we did publicly commit that we would be completing all our third-party audits, which we did in November 2019 at all of our manufacturing facilities. And we intend to be 100% RDS certified by mid next year.
Awesome. That's great to hear. You alluded to a little bit in your response that there were some maybe unexpected milestones or obstacles. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those obstacles were and how you how you had to kind of adapt to overcome them?
Yeah, so I think the big one, and I did kind of hint to this, was timing. When we initially sat down and said, oh, DTS does hit a lot of the RDS elements, I think our initial projection was it would take about 6 to 8 months. We are now, 1 year in, and we believe that, our goal is still to be mid next year, but there's quite a few obstacles along the way that we think will likely push that timing. We're hoping to make it. The big one within that is the ability to segregate within our warehousing. Prior to this, we didn't really have the capability to do that. So that is one that, you know, it's a big change to the business and will require a lot of kind of buy-in across many teams. So we do have a timeline that is associated with that, but it's just, you know, with the state of the world that we're in right now, we're just not too sure if it will be as quick as what we initially thought. The other piece was that prior to RDS, our filing process in assuring traceability throughout the supply chain was extremely manual. So we would ask any of our down-filling manufacturers, which were, just to give some background for everyone on the call, Canada Goose is quite unique in that we're a brand, a manufacturer, as well as a retailer. So we have CG facilities within Canada that do the majority of our down filling domestically. So we had to have the ability to train both our CG facilities as well as our contractors in the new system that would support RDS. So that was one, moving from really a manual system in Excel to a digital version. And then we also identified, of course, our contractor facility. So making sure that these suppliers were prepared to undergo the audits and receive these RDS shipments. As anyone knows, I mean, a lot of these contracting facilities do produce for multiple brands. So we needed to have the kind of incentive and the reason why Canada Goose required this, you know, segregation of down material for our product specifically. And then the last piece was really around what I alluded to earlier, is the fact that we were a brand manufacturer, retailer, and I will say we're very much in the middle of this right now, is, you know, the confusion about what we can say and how we can claim RDS is still kind of being figured out. We have been given a ton of support from our certifying body, IDFL, and what we can say, but I think, you know, because Canada Goose is very unique, we're still trying to figure that out. So those are some of them.
Okay. So I guess out of all of those different areas, if there was advice, I think we probably have some people on the call who maybe are just starting this journey. If you had any advice that you wanted to give them, what would you say?
Yeah, I would say a great first step is really truly understand what you want to say and what you want to have on product, or if you do in regards to RDS, and work backwards. So you know, making sure that you have a solid understanding of when and how you can claim RDS on your products. And our you know, RDS team, we meet weekly in making sure that, you know, all of the objectives within our extremely comprehensive plan are being met. So I would say work backwards from what you want to say. The other thing too is, if you do, of course, have suppliers in countries where English is not a first language, have all of the materials and signage translated. And then the other one was just, of course, you know, buy from down suppliers who are already RDS certified themselves. All of our down suppliers now are RDS certified, so it just makes it a little bit easier in the objectives.
Definitely, and I think we'll talk a little bit later on about where you can go to find RDS certified suppliers. Hopefully most of you already have some of that information, but so I know with you mentioned one of the specific obstacles was getting like the actual certification at the farm level. How were you involved with that work with those down suppliers that were helping to kind of coordinate that, or how involved did Canada Goose get with those suppliers specifically, or did they kind of understand the expectations and handle it with the CB?
Yeah, from a farm level perspective, we were really hands off. It was really just, you know, once we do have RDS, you know, scope certificate and transaction certificate and assurance that the material meets our requirement, we were more focused on the manufacturing stage and supporting the suppliers within our manufacturing. So again, both CG and contractors within Canada. We did conduct trainings at each one of our facilities, and we provided a supplier handbook for all of our suppliers. We also, I think the big piece there is we allowed for iterations of the supplier manual. We did, you know, ask for feedback. Our first few presentations we did with specifically our own internal CG facilities. There was a lot of feedback that, you know, having the ability to change that supplier manual, I think, was important. And then we provided all of our manufacturing facilities with all of the signage and the labeling materials so that they would be ready once RDS material does come on site, which I think did help them, just because it very clearly addressed the requirement to segregate the material. And then also we did, we financially invested in all of the supplier audits. So we paid for all of them. So there was not really any sort of expectation or pressure, specifically when it comes to our contractors, on investing in that. And then because we were, we had our own internal system prior, it was actually a really easy transition at that stage to have them kind of just change the signage from DTS to RDS.
Got it. So I think that unique relationship that you had with your suppliers, it sounds like that made a big difference in being able to really walk with them through the process. I also wanted to ask, we have just probably 1 or 2 minutes left before we should keep going, but I wanted to ask also, just given the reality of the world today, how has COVID changed how you're dealing with this certification process or with your timelines?
Yeah, so we were extremely lucky to have finished all of our supplier audits prior to COVID. So as I mentioned, in November 2019. However, because our offices and facilities have been shut down or are currently producing PPE, our RDS order placement and certification timelines have shifted slightly. As I mentioned, segregation at warehouse level is something that we're still trying to figure that out. And that's that huge logistics piece in updating our systems. So we likely will see a bit of a pivot on our timeline. I hope it's still mid 2021, but we'll see. And then of course, with auditing and physical auditing due to COVID, audits will likely change. And so we're just trying to figure out, if we do proceed with our annual RDS audits in November, December again, we'll have to just kind of figure out, what are those additional precautions that we'll have to take at the audit stage. And then the other piece is, I think I already mentioned the warehousing system. So that's it. We'll see. I think everyone who's in the same boat as us is, we'll just see how it all kind of shakes out. And if we need to pivot or update or change how we do this, we still hope to really get there.
Yeah. And I think it's good maybe to remind people that Textile Exchange is also coming up with, we're in pretty close contact with all of the certification bodies under normal circumstances, but with this COVID and especially how it's affecting auditing, that we've already released, I think, one version and then an updated version of COVID kind of policy adjustments for the certification body. So if anybody else has questions about how to handle certification under COVID, just send us a note and we can point you in the right direction. But Alex, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. I think it's always so helpful to have a real life point of view, and I really appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
No problem.
And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Trini, or maybe to Callie. I can't remember which one.
It's me.
Thanks.
Yeah. So we're just going to take you through some of the support materials that have been mentioned on this webinar. And this presentation, like Rose mentioned, will be sent out after to all of the participants who registered. So these are live links that will direct you specifically to the website. So we link through to the actual standard and the supporting documents of the user manual, the logo use and claims guide as it stands now specifically to the RDS, and then the RDS certification procedures, which is more geared towards the assurance side. We also have videos from past presentations that we've done that explain how the RDS works. So if you want to dive in further to some of the basics, those videos are hosted on our YouTube channel. And then I think the how to get certified and how to find certified suppliers take you to, we have an interactive table on our website that allows you to search by standard. And so it'll list all of the sites, what product that they're offering, what standard or standards they're certified to. And it's pretty interactive, so you can really plug and play with different areas that you're looking for, suppliers or different products that you're looking for. We also have a recorded training on the brand certification for the CCS 2.0. And as Trini mentioned, we're undergoing a CCS 3.0 revision. So that will be getting updated this year, but currently the training for brand certification is available now for the 2.0. And then also a link on how to participate in the Content Claim Standard 3.0 revision. We have just finished the public feedback process, but we're starting to form the international working group and build the stakeholder list. So if you're interested in being involved in that or just receiving updates, I'm pretty sure that link will compose an email to get you signed up for that list. And then lastly, we have a dedicated inbox that Trini manages for Responsible Down. So if you have any specific questions that are unique to your situation or your company or your brand, Trini is well equipped to answer all sorts of examples. So please feel free to reach out and start a conversation about that. And we'll move into the Q&A portion of this webinar. We have a few lined up, and if anybody is mulling something over or thinking about it, feel free to pop it into the Q&A app down at the bottom there, and we have about 15 minutes that we'll take for questions. So I'll start with the list that we have currently. One of the first questions we had is if a broker situation exists between the farm and the slaughterhouse typically, and I think Ashley, would you like to answer that?
Sure, I'm happy to. Most often in industrial supply chains where the sourcing of the down and feather material is coming from the slaughterhouse, there isn't a broker between the farm and the slaughterhouse. In fact, there's usually a very close relationship between the slaughterhouse and the farm. So often a slaughterhouse will even own the animals and just contract to the farm to take care of them for a set period of time until the animals are the proper age for slaughter. So there's usually not a trader in that. In fact, I've never, in all of my experience, I've never seen a case where there's a trader between.
Thank you. The next question, I believe, came in during the claims and labeling section. Excuse me. And the question is there a way to promote this at all? And I think they're referring to the fact if you don't have full chain of custody, but you're wanting to make claims, and Karen, you can feel free to add more detail to this, but if they're wanting to make claims that aren't full chain of custody, how can the brand promote that effort? And I think either Trini or Ashley, if you guys want to jump in there.
Yeah, I think Trini mentioned that there's two categories of general marketing and product specific. And product specific really is that instance where the full chain of custody has been certified, the product is certified, and the product qualifies for the communication. In the general marketing category, that's really any type of communication where a product isn't involved. And in order to qualify for that, really you just need to be able to back up what you're saying. So we've kept general marketing language fairly, it's not allowed to mention products, it's not allowed to mention certification that's in place, but it's really about a commitment. So some examples of how to promote that commitment are linking to your down policy or to your animal welfare policy, where you list off, reliance on a standard like the Responsible Down standard. We've also seen cases where people will use like a blog post or a social media story that really talks about what the brand is doing when it comes to down, without mentioning that the products, which products or if any of them have actually been certified or where the material is going. And this is an area that we want to add even more detail and more guidance within the claims framework that we're working on to provide some more specific examples of how companies can talk about the standard when they're kind of in that progress phase, when they're working towards product certification. And I've heard from a lot of brands and retailers in particular on what type of instances might be helpful, how to interact more with e-commerce, with social media, with some of these more digital platforms to really tell the story of what RDS says. So there's definitely options to communicate about the RDS in advance of having that full product certification. But we do want the full product certification to be in place before product claims are made, really to protect the integrity of the certification.
Great, thank you. Another question we have from an anonymous attendee is what differentiates you from the IDS, which just to clarify, the IDS is an IDFL certification for down.
Sure. So we actually, I think it looked like we had someone from IDFL on the call. So if they want to jump in with any notes or comments, feel free to do that. But whenever Alex was talking about the responsible down standard, I think she brought up that area of stakeholder engagement. And I think that that's a big difference with the responsible down standard from some of the, definitely from a certification that's owned by a certification body. Again, I think they have a really robust process of stakeholder engagement. There's also, having that assurance from a third party is also a really important component. With the responsible down standard and Textile Exchange being a member of ICEAL, there's a certain level of transparency and accountability that we have to how we make decisions around what actually goes in the standard, that the standard itself is fairly transparent, that anyone can download a copy of it, and that we're specific enough on the details to allow for certification decisions to also be fairly straightforward and transparent. The other issue is I think the distinction between being a standards owner and being a certification body. And so if you look in some of the international guidelines on certification bodies like ISO, they will have what they call this, having a triangulation, I guess, of the certification decision, where the person that's responsible for doing the auditing is not the one that makes the final certification decision. And there's that kind of that firewall in place with the certification decision. And I think another important component is having separation from providing the certification service to owning the standard. So Textile Exchange as an independent standards owner, we can provide more kind of, I guess, free market options where companies can choose what certification body they want to work with. But there's still a consistent application of the standard. So if a CB is not available in a certain region, they can go with another one. And then also if the certification body makes a decision that they have questions about or don't agree with, they have another outlet that they can take to kind of offer a more neutral view or to help mediate in some of those cases. So I think the fact that Textile Exchange runs the standard and is separate from the, offering the certification service is definitely a unique factor for the responsible down standard.
Thanks. The next question, as the RDS is a farm level certification and deals with animal welfare, somebody is asking if we can elaborate on if and how animal welfare advocates such as PETA, et cetera, are involved and consulted in the standard development. Yeah,
this is a great question. Most often we know that, with the International Working Group, one of the things that we aim to include as a perspective is this broad category that we call civil society, which is essentially kind of like public interest. And animal welfare, given that that's one of the main goals of the responsible down standard, animal welfare is a really big area of expertise and area of representation that's needed in the standards process. And so we have worked in the past really closely with Humane Society International, with Four Paws, and those organizations have a lot of dedicated knowledge, research. They've done a lot of on the ground work to identify really what is best practice in animal husbandry, where are the specific risks with having keeping ducks and geese domestically in the farm system, in an industrial system, where are the risks of live plucking most prevalent, and having that kind of perspective is absolutely invaluable to our process. We distinguish a little bit between what we refer to as an animal welfare organization and an animal activist organization. We definitely see a role for activist organizations, and a lot of times what PETA campaigns and those types of things, while they can be very disruptive, to put it mildly, those types of awareness raising, we think that is a valuable service that they provide to the industry by being able to raise awareness to the risks that some of these animals are in the farming situation. Where PETA has less focus is on the specific interventions that could allow for improvement at the farm level. So what they're really, their aim is to eliminate the use of animal materials. And while we definitely applaud that vision, we also see that there are animals that are being raised, and if we ignore them, and if we don't intervene and have improvement opportunities and incentives and rewards for those players that are doing a good job, then we're keeping those animals that are currently being kept at risk. And so partnering with animal welfare organizations that have a lot of that expertise in animal welfare outcomes is super vital to the success of the standard, to make sure that that we're not in a vacuum of the industry, that we're listening to people who, they're not involved in the trade, they're not buying and selling anything, they're really just advocating for the welfare of the animals. And that's a hugely important role for us throughout this process. So we're really thankful to have partnership with those organizations.
Thank you. So we have a couple more questions that are coming in last minute. So I'll ask Ashley one of the first questions that we received, and then maybe you can either quickly move through or we can answer after with follow-up emails. But you alluded to it a little bit with our stakeholder mapping process, and somebody's asking, is there a gap analysis available for looking at stakeholders, and if we've had any collaboration with other organizations such as DownPass?
Yeah, great question. So yes, we have, and there's been a kind of a larger group that Textile Exchange hasn't led, but a group of organizations that are all interested in down, where Textile Exchange has been there representing the Responsible Down Standard. We've also had, I think, representatives from the DownPass certification, as well as the Traceable Down Standard from NSF. And having those relationships and those partnerships are really crucial. I think we have not done a gap analysis, but there have been gap analyses done by those animal welfare organizations that I mentioned. I think Four Paws in particular has a gap analysis that they've done between Textile Exchange and some of the other standards like DownPass and TDS. And so, yeah, I think that's probably the best place to go if you're looking for kind of a side-by-side comparison of the standards.
Great, and so we have just a couple minutes left for the last question. Somebody is asking, is there a method to verify RDS labeling claims and the validity of the transaction certificates?
Yes, so for validating the validity of a transaction certificate, for every TC, which is what we call them for shorthand, there will be a certification body listed on that TC, and they will be able to verify that validity for the transaction certificate. And for the labeling claims, this is something that we're working on with this claims framework to develop a more robust process. But for labeling, the best thing is if an actual product is labeled, look for the number, the certification number, or the name of who is managing the certification, like who is the last supplier that was certified, and then also the name of the certification body. And that will give you an idea, and then you can compare that to our certified supplier list to make sure that that entity is actually certified. I also know that there are some certification bodies that use either on the TC or in other places will use like a web link or a QR code in order to validate that transaction certificate. So that's another helpful helpful way to validate those. But CBs will be able to validate transaction certificates, and Textile Exchange has a database of all of the certified suppliers, which should always be listed on a product claim. So yeah.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. I think we're at the top of the hour, and I'll hand it back to Rose for closing.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you to our speakers today, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. As a friendly reminder, all unanswered questions will be answered via email. I think we got to them all, but if there is any that are left, I know that they will answer those. And an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.